Hey everyone! Welcome to American History 1, Video 1.1. I'm Miss Barrett and I talk fast, so be sure to take careful notes and don't forget you can pause the video if you need to. This video is about exploration and conquest, so we're going to start out today with a quote about the result of what we'll be talking about today. So this quote is from a Spanish priest who witnessed the treatment of Native Americans by the Spanish firsthand. Here's our quote. "The pattern established at the outset has remained to this day, and the Spaniards still do nothing save tear the natives to shreds, murder them, and inflict upon them untold misery, suffering, and distress, tormenting, harrying, and persecuting them mercilessly." So our question we'll be looking at today is, how did this situation, Spanish mistreating indigenous people so brutally, how did this come to be? So let's look at our essential questions that we'll answer in our video today. Our first essential question, what led Europeans to the New World? And then how did colonization affect indigenous people? What led Europeans to the New World? To answer that question, we need to go back to our world history knowledge and remember some background here, set the stage about the economics and political conditions that were going on in Europe at the time. We've got the Renaissance going on, that flowering of art and literature, also flowering of wealth for many European leaders. So we have many monarchs using that wealth that they're gaining from the Renaissance to send explorers out. We also see improved nautical technology, so better sails, the invention of the astrolabe, this contraption we see here, which is going to help navigators sail farther, gain more information about wind patterns, about current patterns, and in general be better at sea travel. And in Spain, we also have a situation of a recent victory in a long, religiously motivated war, a crusade, where Spain had recently driven out the Moors, which are Muslim people, and Jewish people out of Spain. And so that leaves kind of an only Catholic, Christian, Spanish nation that's feeling pretty proud of itself, pretty nationalistic, and determined to continue spreading Catholic Christianity, that empire, all over the world. All right, so what was going on in Europe is not quite the same as what these explorers actually wanted. So the first thing that they're looking for are natural resources. So we might think about gold and silver, but also cash crops like sugar and tobacco and the ability to grow those. They're also looking for a trade route to Asia. So we want to remember that in 1400, Europeans thought this was what the world map looked like. They didn't know about the Americas, and their goal was to get here to India and Asia to trade for those silks and spices and really desirable items. And the only two ways that they knew to do that were either to go by boat all the way around the Horn of Africa or to go over land and potentially be robbed or charged a fee to use a road. And so neither of those seemed like great options, and they knew the world was round, and they thought, if I sail west, I can arrive east some way. They didn't know the Americas were here. They thought this was Antarctica, by the way. That's where it was. So they're looking for a trade route to Asia. And then our third goal of the explorers is they want to spread Christianity. So remember that same idea, especially Spain makes this a priority. And then if you're an explorer, part of what's motivating you is wanting to get rich and famous. Most of the explorers were not from wealthy families. Christopher Columbus did not grow up rich. So they're looking for God, gold, and glory, spreading Christianity, gaining wealth for themselves, and also gaining glory in their home country. And all this leads us to our sort of fourth grade rhyme. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. We've got a portrait here of Columbus that may or may not be what he actually looked like. Obviously, there were no photographs in the 1400s, so we can't be sure. Christopher Columbus's first voyage, he takes 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. And the first island that he lands on, which would be in the present-day Bahamas, he thinks that he has found India. So he then moves on to keep sailing around, hits Cuba, hits the island of Hispaniola, which is sort of today Haiti or the Dominican Republic. And he really thinks he's landed in the Far East, and that's why he calls the people that he encounters, he calls them Indians, which is a label that is still misused today to describe indigenous people in the Americas. And he returns home to Spain to tell about what he's found, And it's subsequent voyages after this first voyage where he manages to really do some real damage to the people that he's encountered. So Christopher Columbus, as we'll talk about in class, he's enslaving native people, bringing them back to Spain, establishing colonies, of which he was governor. And we'll talk more about this idea of discovery and how much credit or honor or blame Columbus should be given for his voyages, considering the impact that they actually had on the world. Which brings us to our next question. How did colonization impact indigenous people? In the centuries after Columbus, Spanish monarchs continue sending explorers to set up more colonies and take more resources from the New World. And here are just a few of the conquistadors who enslaved native people and got children's books written about them. So the general pattern of conquest that most of these guys followed over and over again was like this: using brutal military force to take over the indigenous empires, so that you might think about the Inca, the Aztec, hundreds of other smaller societies, enslave the native people, force them to work for you, to start accumulating resources that you can ship back to Spain. So that might be gold, silver, other precious metals, or work on growing and cultivating cash crops. And then the last element would be forcing them to convert to Christianity. Say that you're doing all of this in the name of God, and forcing them to either swear off their own religion and say that they've become Christian now, or else be put to death. And later on in the 15 and 1600s, the Spanish developed the encomienda system. And so this is a system where prominent Spanish nobles were given large tracts of land in the New World by the King of Spain. And that word, encomienda, comes from the Spanish verb encomendar, which means to entrust. So the Spaniards were not only responsible for managing and cultivating the land, they were also expected to care for the indigenous people who lived on that land. And the reason why I put care for in air quotes there is because what they really meant is convert to Christianity. So we can think of the encomienda system as similar to the feudal system in the Middle Ages in Europe, where there's a big house or castle where the nobility lives, and the Native Americans are sort of serfs who have no choice but to work for the benefit of the nobility, the encomenderos. So it's really a system of slavery, and the encomenderos were generally extremely harsh and brutal in their treatment of the native people working for them, working them literally to death, mining silver or growing crops, and we see native people dying by the thousands in the system. Which brings us to our question and answer portion. One question that I often get is this: why didn't native people fight back? And the answer is simple, which is that they did. And they won, sometimes more often than they are given credit for in most textbooks. One example of a temporarily, at least, successful uprising was Tupac Amaru II, his attempt to rise up in Peru in the late 1700s, where he actually encouraged those enslaved native people to execute their masters. And he won several battles before ultimately being captured and executed by being drawn and quartered, which has to be one of the most horrible ways to die. And it really shows that the Spanish were willing to be extremely cruel and also had technological advantages like guns and horses that the native people, at least initially, did not have access to. Tupac Amaru's story is legend in South America and also inspired a woman to name her son that we know better today as Tupac Amaru Shakur, to name him after this Incan leader. Next question. Aren't you forgetting something, Miss Barrett, like a big thing that killed millions? And the answer is yes. The diseases that Europeans brought to the Americas did way more damage than any intentional action that the conquistadors took, mainly because the immune systems of indigenous people had never really been exposed to these types of germs before, so they didn't have a resistance built up in their system. So some of the big ones are smallpox, measles, typhus, and cholera, ravaging Native American populations. So if we think back to that first island where Columbus landed in the Bahamas, just 30 years later, the entire indigenous population was completely wiped out by disease, and it's actually estimated that 90% of all Native Americans died as a result of contact with Europeans, and this is largely due to diseases. Next question. Did anything good come from Europeans arriving in the Americas? That depends on your perspective, of course, but lots of new goods and crops were introduced to the New World as a result of European colonization. And you can see some of those here. Our last question, how did the Spanish justify treating indigenous people so horribly? How did they live with themselves? How is it possible they could treat other human beings in such a brutal and cruel way? There's not just one answer, but it is true that they had a very Eurocentric worldview. So they saw Native people as being very uncivilized because their clothes and their language and their religious beliefs were very different. And so therefore it was possible for them to sort of see these people as less than human. They definitely treated them in a way as though they were less than human. So many of these conquistadors also believed, and I know how crazy this is going to sound, they believed they were actually helping indigenous people by forcing them to convert to Christianity. So the idea being that even if they were slaves in their lifetime, they would be admitted to heaven when they died, even if the reason why they died was from being overworked as a slave. So they thought that no matter how they treated them, it was still a good thing overall because they had been forced to convert to Christianity. It's also important to remember that one of the reasons why we even know about all these bad things that happened is because there were some Spanish priests who recognized that what was going on was wrong and wrote about it. So that would be an example, Bartolome de las Casas, whose quote started off our video today about Spanish treatment of Native Americans. All right, this has been your first video. Make sure you can answer these essential questions, identify these key terms. Take care, and I will see you in class.